Hello, this is Annie, and I'm going to read you the part of my book in the Grail Mysteries that's about the Winter Solstice. So I'm just going to dive into it, and I hope you enjoy it. This is chapter 17 of the Grail Mysteries. Big-eared Clust have been trying to get Merlin's attention for some time. The trio of ancients, the magician, the bard, and the fairy navigator, had returned almost deliriously triumphant from the completion of their alchemical operation in Park Wood. They were absolutely ecstatic that they'd managed to create the eighth treasure of Britain, a maypole, which now stretched from the upper worlds to the underworld, and so the whole company of the Grail had been in great spirits as they celebrated long into the night on the ear of the great bull. But as the red dawn sun came up, Clust and Drem began to feel that not all was right. Guilty and Hen had not returned. However, neither of them wanted to react prematurely or worry the rest of the group unnecessarily, and so Clust suggested that he try to get Merlin on his own. But that was proving quite difficult. Merlin seemed to be too busy now to even sit in one place for more than a twinkle of a wren's eye. His jovial mood had changed to a serious one, and he was beginning to exude a greater sense of urgency as he gathered them all together for the last briefing. Once they were all sitting comfortably in a circle around him, he began to address them. "We're now into the third and final day of the quest," were his first words, "and we must complete it within the next turn of the earth around the sun. If we don't finish within this day and night, we'll have failed to provide the necessary conditions for the dreaming seed to flower in a millennium and a half, when the people on earth will begin to emerge from the spell of unconsciousness." However, I'm starting to get concerned. By this stage, I'd been hoping that we'd have been further along in our schedule. Now we're going to be really hard pushed. There are still another 5 treasures to bury, and I'm not sure if we'll get round in time. Then he materialized, as if from nowhere, the 9th treasure. It was a huge, arched, wrought iron sign that spelled out in tall letters, "The Havens." "We need to bury the sign for the Havens at Lantakai, the home of the shoemaker fairies," he told the assembled group. Just then Taliesin sneezed. Then he sneezed once more. Merlin looked at him irritated. "I told you you could only come with us yesterday at your own risk," he snapped at him. "There was no need for you to be there. Now look, you've caught a cold." He hung his head apologetically. He was feeling a little silly about his insistence upon joining them yesterday. It was true he had been completely surplus to requirements. But he could not change his character. He could never bear to miss a great magical escapade if one were in the offing, and especially as he might be recalled upon to record it later for posterity. "Well, I think you'd better stay here and keep warm," Merlin said gruffly. Taliesin groaned. "I'm serious," Merlin went on. "We don't want you catching pneumonia. You'll be much better off here on the Bull, where it's forever Maytime, because after everlasting spring at Lantakai, we're going straight on to eternal winter to bury the last 4 treasures." Taliesin sighed with disappointment and then nodded reluctantly in agreement. "I'm sure a couple of the others won't mind staying to keep you company," Merlin went on. "Perhaps Drem could be your eyes and Clust could be your ears." Clust stood up, delighted that Merlin had finally noticed him. "How about you, Clust?" he asked him. "Would you mind remaining here to keep Taliesin company?" "Of course I don't mind at all, sir," Clust replied, his big ears twitching in agreement. He realized then that he and Drem would not probably get another chance to raise their concerns about Jilty and Hen, so he took a deep breath and said, "But first of all, Drem and I have an important matter that we want to share with you." Drem nodded, his huge eyes bulging more than ever. Clust cleared his throat before continuing. "Well, we're very sorry to have to report this terrible news. But given what we saw and heard yesterday, and the fact that they haven't yet returned, we think there's a possibility that Jilty and Hem may have fallen into the underworld." That got everyone's attention instantly. A shocked hush descended upon the group like a dark thundercloud. Each of them knew only too well what a terrible calamity it would be to slip accidentally into the underworld. They had heard chilling tales about those who had. There were even a few cases in which the person who fell managed somehow, against all odds, to escape, but had returned to Earth to find that their friends and relatives had been long gone, dead and buried and forgotten. "Are you sure?" Merlin finally asked, breaking the stunned silence. "How do you know?" "We're not sure, sir. Well, not completely sure," Clust replied. "But as you must know, the songs about me state that if I was buried 7 fathoms deep in the earth, I would still hear an ant that was 50 miles away stirring from its bed in the morning. And the songs about Drem state that..." Yes, Merlin said it irritatedly. "And your point is?" "We saw and heard some strange goings-on over on Dundon Hill yesterday," Drem replied, taking up the story. "After Jilty and Hen buried Bran's head, I saw them go up the hill with some women, and then they disappeared into an apple orchard. Well, you know what they say about enchanted orchards in fairyland, how you're not meant to eat the apples." Then Clust heard Jilty shout something. "It sounded like hen," said Clust. "Then it all went silent. We weren't too worried at first, but now that they haven't returned," and his voice trailed off, sadly and uncertainly. "I see," said Merlin, stroking his beard ponderously. His old wrinkled face was rapidly sagging with dismay. "They haven't come back, that's true," he replied. "So I think you could be right. Oh dear, what to do?" Merlin felt guilty that he'd been so intent on celebrating his own victory that he had not noticed that 2 key members of his crew were missing. His countenance began to darken with a terrible foreboding, and the weight of the burden of the responsibility of the quest caused his shoulders to droop. In his mind the spectre loomed of the madness that had overwhelmed him many years ago, and that had caused his entrails to wither in the agony of grief after he lost his nephew at the Battle of Arthurian. Then Manawyddan spoke. "We do have a golden dragon," he offered. "What's that got to do with it?" Clust asked. "A golden dragon is the only being that can cross at will into other dimensions and out again," Manawyddan told him. "That's true," Merlin replied in a hopeless tone. "But do you have any idea how vast the underworld is? There are some that say it may even be infinite in size. So how would Ormelinda know where to go to rescue the 2 dwarfs? Ormelinda is the golden dragon, by the way. "That's a problem right there, I grant you that," Manawyddan agreed, nodding sadly and lapsing back into his thoughts again. But Clust was not satisfied. "I thought that fairyland was itself part of the underworld," he said. "No," Manawyddan replied, although that's a common misapprehension. It's about time and space. Fairyland follows the underworld in terms of time, but it's part of the middle world in terms of space. So it can act rather like an anteroom that adjoins the 2 worlds. Or perhaps a bridge is a better way of putting it, between the middle world and the upper world. Clust nodded to show that he understood, but nobody else was interested in geographical or cosmological explanations. As the realization spread that they had no way of rescuing Jilty and Hen, a black wave of depression was fast sweeping over the company. There were tears from some of the dwarves, as each one tried to assimilate the terrible news that their dear friends were likely lost to them forever. The rubbery lower lip of Gweddel, son of Gwastad, dropped down to his navel, and he pulled his upper lip over his head like a hood. Merlin was feeling it personally deep down in his gut. After all, he had handpicked each member of the crew. He had known Jilty and Hen for most of their lives. He was a good friend to their families and within their communities, and it would now be his task to give them the terrible news of their passing. He put his hands over his head and his face, as if to try to ward off the ghouls of despair. It really did seem as if the quest had ground to a halt in the swamp of despond. But then Arinrod stood up and stepped forward into the circle. The rising sun against the pale apricot sky was sending down its first bright beam in her direction, spotlighting her platinum-haired beauty. "We have to pull ourselves together," she told the assembled company. "We owe it to the future of humanity. We've been entrusted by the highest powers to bury these 13 treasures around the Isle of Glass to protect the sovereignty of the British Isles, and we have to fulfill that quest, no matter what cost to ourselves. There was bound to be some sacrifice. We have to continue and let the triple goddesses weave their golden cloth of fate as they may. At least in that way, we'll all be in alignment with our highest purpose, and then the outcome will be for the greater good of all. We none of us have the full picture about what's going on, neither can we see into the future, so all we can do at this stage is to put our faith into acting in truth and integrity, and let divine providence prevail." Arinrod's words fell like dewdrops of refreshment and rejuvenation, and so gradually each one of them managed to pull themselves together in order to get on with the quest. In the end, Drem and Clust were chosen to remain behind in Forever Mayday, to act as the red-eyed and sniffling Taliesin's eyes and ears. Merlin quickly herded the rest of them aboard Ormelinda, the golden dragon, to fly off to the land of springtime, Atlanticae. However, in the end, they only got to pay a brief flying visit to this small hamlet of shoemaker fairies. Merlin wanted to be in and out quickly before the residents awoke. Shoemaker fairies are not always the most friendly of creatures. Well, not if they do not know you, and they seem to take an inordinately long amount of time before they decide that they do know a person. They are a quiet and reserved sort of fairy and like to keep to themselves. So Merlin raised his finger to his lips to hush everyone as Ormelinda swept silently over the low-roofed dwellings of Lanticae, which were thatched with white swan feathers. The gardens were showing the first signs of spring, with bright yellow dandelions bursting up through pristine manicured lawns that were bordered with neat rows of daffodils, tulips and muscari, and many had flower pots of deliciously fragrant blue and pink hyacinths outside their front doors. Then they saw the river Brue to the north. Just before they reached its banks, they looked down to see 3 ancient spreading yew trees. Ormelinda headed towards the yews and then came swiftly and softly into land. The arch sign for the havens was so heavy that it took the whole company to unload it and then carry it at Merlin's direction to the middle yew tree. They buried it as fast as they could. Then they were off again, swifter than swifts. Manawydan was in the lead on Embar, piloting them northwards. They flew over the lake at Southmoor, where the huge silver salmon of wisdom was swimming around. Next they swept over the summit of Glastonbury Tor and saw the fiery phoenix nesting on its smouldering bed of ashes in the foothills. Soon after that, the air began to turn distinctively colder, and it was not long before they were flying over white and frozen low-lying fields. Cradelad had been sitting quietly, but now she suddenly stood up tall on Ormelinda's back, with the enchanted sword Fragarac dangling heavily from her waist. Holding on to the dragon's vertebrae to steady herself, she called out to Manawydan, "Keep going until we reach Heart Lake." He turned and nodded to show that he had heard her. Then they flew into the time of betwixt and between. The sky could not seem to make up its mind whether it was day or night. Thick black stormy clouds hung brooding over skeletons of trees, their naked branches cowering in submission to the unrelenting, harsh, bitter wind. The land stood sternly, hard and unforgiving. They had reached the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice, and it was deep midwinter. Soon they found themselves looking down upon a vast expanse of what would have been water if it had not been completely frozen. Then they saw the proudly held head and wide-spreading antlers of the White Hart, crowned with a wreath of red berried holly. It was standing on a snow-covered bank amid hundreds of bushes of red Christmas roses, and next to a large pile of frost-covered Yule logs. Behind it loomed a deep, dark forest of tall pines, spruces and firs that were all smouldering crimson red through the auspices of millions of glittering fireflies. The white hart was looking straight at Cradelad. Then it turned its gaze pointedly to a place in the frozen-over wasteland. The whole company followed the direction of its eyes, to discover that the lake was now covered in thousands of small gliding elven skaters that were dressed in red and white, and using their sharp diamond blades to engrave magical symbols in the ice with their feet. They appeared to be gliding gracefully to the sounds of an orchestral symphony. It could only be heard faintly at first, but then it grew louder. They couldn't see its source, yet the auditory frequencies and rhythms of this enchanting masterpiece were piercing some of them deeply. They felt bereft when they heard the bittersweet cry of the oboe. They yearned in agony with the entreating violin, and the mournful lament of the cello cut into their hearts and made them cry. Even the demonic-looking Morfran, son of Tegid the Bald, had tears running down his warp-pitted cheeks, and a livid green pus streamed out of his enormous, bulbous, black-headed, pitted nose. "It's too sad, this music," Morfran wailed. "Make it stop," he said to Merlin. Merlin just patted him on the back. "No, it's entirely appropriate to our time and place," Merlin replied. "It's a requiem to honour the death of the old king. The old king represents the old year, which is now passing, and giving way to the new year." The haunting melody plodded on like a funeral procession for some time, but finally the last notes of this dirge gently faded away. Then a flash of iridescent turquoise blue lit up the blackened skies, and it was quickly joined by another flaring light of turquoise green. Then there was a further flickering fluorescence, this time of blue-green, and then another of lapis lazuli blue shot through with gold. The coloured lights began to pulsate and dance, and then they flowed into one another to form a shimmering peacock's tail. The brilliant aurora now sparkled, as if the sugar-plum fairy had dusted them with clouds of icing sugar. Small gossamer-winged sprites were now revealed in the leaves, in crystal-studded white satin ballroom dresses. They were pirouetting and performing arabesques on branches that dangled with white glowworms, red and white mushrooms, and walnuts in shells, and candied apricots, and bunches of cinnamon bark tied in red ribbons, and clementines studded with star anise, and grinning gingerbread men that sported gleaming blackcurrant eyes. Cradelad looked up. She could see that the pole star was now directly over the forest. So she began to chant. "To the north, soil of my mind, blue melting glaciers birthing borates from ice. The stars of the borealis circle like glittering brides. Roll your blessings and grace to the sun and the moon, lovingly reconciled. Celebrate with us today. Unto us is born a child." As her last words sounded, an apparition began to materialize on the back of the white hart. It was a tall fairy woman dressed completely in white, and in her lap, wrapped in swaddling bands, was a babe that she had delivered. Beside the mounted midwife and stroking the babe's head stood the mother, the dark and voluptuous Morgan the Fay. Then suddenly the skies broke with the sound of heralding trumpets blasting away in triumph and victory. "The radiant child is born," Merlin cried. King of kings, Lord of lords. Long live the new king, long live the new year." The skaters took his blessings as their cue, and they began to glide round and round in circles. Soon their skates had engraved 2 large overlapping rings on the white frozen lake. The Vesica Pisces, Merlin informed them. Like a classical Vesica Pisces, it had a smaller oval-shaped circle in the centre, and the skaters were giving this part of their design special attention with their sharp cutting boots, until it suddenly fell away, revealing the black freezing cold depths underneath. Then the pale braceleted arm of a woman arose from under the water. Cradelad held Fragger up high in the air, blade upwards, and then she shouted, "Lady of the Lake, the company of the Grail greets you. We're returning into your care the magical sword, forged by Govannon, which is infallible in battle, and the 10th treasure of the Blessed Isles. We ask you to preserve this sword of truth until it is called upon again by the one whose destiny it is to wield it." She began to spiral her strong sword arm in ever-increasing circles outwards, wider and wider, while clinging on to Ormelinda's vertebrae with the other hand as the dragon zoomed in low. Then Cradelad released the sword. Fragerac flew high, in an arc, its silver shaft mirroring the flashing peacock tail colours of the aurora borealis. Then it fell down into the waiting hand of the Lady of the Lake, who clasped it firmly by the haft, and then instantly submerged it under the black and icy depths. So that's the end of chapter 17. Thank you very much for listening. It's actually from the Grail Mysteries, which is my most recent book, and it's currently 1/3 off on Amazon. If you want to get it now, it will be 1/3 off until New Year's Day 2018. So if you're listening before then, I would like to wish you a wonderful winter solstice on Thursday. I'd like to wish you also a very Merry Christmas and a very, very happy New Year. Blessings to all. Thank you.